Shalom, shalom, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of the Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our eternal and undivided capital since King David's time, Jerusalem. I am here today speaking with a professor, an author, and a friend, Professor Larry Dominich. Shalom, Larry.
Hello, Avi. Shalom, Avi.
It is wonderful having you. I believe this is a very important conversation. This is less about understanding exactly what is happening today and why it's happening, because I think that's so complex.
Right.
But I thought having this talk with you would be very, very important to at least for people to have an understanding of the historical significance of how the situation developed to be today, both on a, I guess, a macro geopolitical level in terms of what this Russia-Ukraine crisis is about. And it didn't start today. It didn't start 5 years ago, even 10 years ago. Yeah. And then you also have the specific Jewish historical perspective on our history of the Jewish communities that lived in Russia and Ukraine and Eastern Europe, in terms of your book specifically on the impact of World War I on the Jews and the Jews who lived in that area. So why don't you lift the book up, right? The impact of World War I on the Jewish people. I read it from cover to cover. I could not put it down. All right. I'm a history buff, but even the way you wrote it, and you brought the historical information and its eyewitness accounts and historical documentation, I just couldn't put it down. It's not a dry book. It really reads very well and easily. And I believe everyone should buy that book and read it, because it's such. We all know about World War II. Hardly anyone knows about the impact of World War I on the Jewish people. So why did you write that book, Larry? And what kind of impact do you want people to have upon reading that book?
Right. Well, Avi, events in history don't happen in a vacuum.
Right.
The more we understand the past, the more we can understand the present. And the history of the First World War significantly has impacted the world since. And I also want to relate to the reader. I want to give the reader a sense of, to relate to the reader, to give the reader a sense of appreciation of the past, understanding of the past. And as you said, Avi, a very significant era in our history, the First World War, has been eclipsed by the enormity of the Shoah. And in fact, it's often said, the First World War really led to the Second World War and the Holocaust. And I used to relate Germany to like a boxer in the ring, where he's battered up a little bit and he's staggering around, and the ref calls the fight. He puts his arms up, and the fighter's still ready to fight. He said, "Wait a minute, why are you calling this?" And I kind of think of Germany in that respect. And 1918 came, Germans were forced to surrender, but the fight was still in them. And we certainly saw that decades down the road.
All right. And so I'm going to take a step back, try to connect it to today, and we're going to go back and forth.
Right.
So let's just go back in terms of Ukraine. Ukraine, obviously part of the Soviet Empire back in World War I. How many Jews lived in Ukraine? What was the status of the Jewish communities there at the time?
Right. So over 1 million Jews lived in Ukraine, and
wow, 1 million Jews.
Ukraine.
That's before the World War I. That's after World War I.
That was before World War I, and as many as 1.5 million Jews. And Ukraine really is the bulk of Jewry in Eastern Europe, along with Lithuania, and you have, of course, the Baltic states had large Jewish communities, but also Belarus. When you put these communities together, all together, with Poland, because Poland was part of the Russian Empire.
Right.
So put all these communities together, we're talking about 6 million Jews, by far the largest Jewish community in the world. Really the center of Jewry, you can say, was Eastern Europe. And it was a diverse community, many different aspects, and there were Hasidim in Ukraine, there were Mitnagdim, there were Maskilim, there were all types. And
different type of, I'm just going to give explanation for those who are not familiar with those Hebrew Jewish terms. You're talking about different type of religious groups, and also the more intelligent, the intelligentsia, who are less connected, who are moving away from religion and being more secularized.
They sought to modernize Jewry.
Right, modernize, secularize the Jewish community.
Then Operation Barbarossa in June 1941, the invasion of Nazi forces. All Jewish communities in Central Russia at that time were in dire straits, and the danger was real. And from community to community, Ukrainian Jews will face massacres, as Lithuanian Jews, as Belarus, and
that's at the hands of whom?
It's at the hands mostly of Nazis, but there are Ukrainians who were involved. Avi, now you mentioned that point. When the war broke out.
Which war?
When the Second War broke out.
Second World War, okay.
Yeah.
Because there's so much to unpack here.
Right,
so I want to make sure people understand which aspect. Yes, go.
Right. Sometimes one sees, hears nowadays about the pogroms in the Ukraine. And
what years were the pogroms?
I'm gonna get to that because there's so much to say.
Right.
But let's get back to the Second World War. The Second World War, 4.5 to 7 million Ukrainians fought for the Red Army, the Russians. 1.5 million Ukrainians died in battle. So the vast majority of Ukrainians fought with the Russians against the Nazis.
Okay.
A small minority, maybe 250,000 of Ukrainians had sided with the Nazis, fought with the Germans, and some were in the SS.
Interesting. So even back then, there was a division in the Ukrainian people.
That's correct.
Wow. As today, in a sense, because today also you have the pro-Russian Ukrainians and the pro-Western European Ukrainians.
Right. Well, but also, the Ukrainians have their history too. And there were many Ukrainians who were extremely bitter towards the Russians. 1932 and 1933, the Holodomor was a collectivization. In other words, Ukraine is the breadbasket of Russia. In fact, it still is today. Produces tremendous amounts of wheat. And Stalin collectivized the farmers into kolkhoz, into collective farms, and he was demanding too much more wheat than they can provide, took it, and the people faced mass starvation. And millions of Ukrainians died of starvation at that time. And
even though they had the wheat to be able to provide themselves, but because Stalin took it and took too much, they were then starved of the natural product that they themselves were producing.
Correct. And he sent police, and he supervised very carefully. And there was some Ukrainians who refused to comply altogether, and they would be executed. And
by Stalin's Russia.
Correct. This is a very tragic era. And so
is the 1930s?
1932-33. The collectivization was initially announced by Stalin in 1928. What he did in 1932 is he increased the amount of wheat that farmers had to provide. And so this turned out, to be an enormous tragedy. And so what you have, tremendous resentment, but despite the resentment, notwithstanding, there's still majority of Ukrainians still fought with the Russians in the Second World War. And those Ukrainians who were served on the SS, like I said, were in a minority, but they caused enormous damage. They inflicted tremendous atrocities upon the Jewish people. They were there. Babi Yar and Lvov had a pogrom as well. Babi Yar, 42,000 Jews were murdered in 3 days. They caused tremendous destruction. However, it does not represent the entire nation. It does not represent all the Ukrainians.
So this is something very interesting, because I've also grown up on the stories that the major difference people like to say, or in history classes, is that the Ukrainians who murdered the Jews in the Holocaust were worse than the Nazis, because they did it willingly, as opposed to the Nazis, who they were only doing it because they were given orders to do it. Is that a correct?
Yes.
Okay, so that's correct.
No, it is correct, and the fact that they were local, and they knew the Jewish neighbors. They knew the terrain.
They knew the terrain. They knew the Jewish villages,
right,
etc. But still, you're saying that was a minority of the Ukrainian people. That the majority of the Ukrainians, again, we're talking about World War II, sided and fought with the Russians against Germany. So is that saying that majority of Ukrainians were not necessarily Jew haters?
It's hard to say what's in someone's heart, but I would say actively, historically, there were Ukrainians who either refrained, or some looked the other way. Some went out of their way to save Jews. We have listings of Ukrainians who saved Jewish lives, and it's the Cossack in history of Russia, and Ukraine, that's very often referenced, are the Cossacks. Who are the Cossacks?
Right.
And we talk about them, and the Cossacks were bands of, we call, rogue troops. In other words, they didn't have their own commanders. They didn't have they weren't linked necessarily to any other army, and so very often they would act on their own. And the Cossacks were very often the cause of these troubles, but was not necessarily the neighbors, wasn't necessarily the Ukrainian people. And of course they had support from some, but when you really look back at the disasters under the Cossacks, they were some of the worst disasters in the history of the Jewish people until the Shoah. And we're talking... and
what were the years?
We're talking about a few specific rebellions. By the way, the Cossacks didn't just rise up against the Jews. There was always amid another rebellion, another revolt. And it has to do with Ukraine itself. Ukraine is a nation. It's an identity that was under, very often under the control of others. They usually did not have their own independence. So 1648, 1649, Gezerot Tachbatat, Khmelnytsky revolt is well known and remembered as some of the greatest horrors in the history of the Jewish community of Ukraine.
Back in the 17th century, you're taking
1648. That's correct. And the truth is that many of the descendants of these butchers were involved in more atrocities against the Jews down the road. And this was a revolt against Polish control over land, Polish landlords in the Ukraine, and it was also against some Lithuanian landlords. And in the middle are the Jews. And it's estimated between a third and a half of Ukrainian Jewry was massacred during the Khmelnytsky revolt of 1648.
Wow.
It went on until 1654, and we have accounts. It has been written about. 100 years later, there was another revolt in the Ukraine by Cossacks, perpetrated by Ivan Gunta and Maxim Zelnicek and around the area of Uman. And once again, this was written about by survivors. There are accounts, and it wasn't as wide scale. It wasn't the same extent of destruction, but estimates differ as to how many were murdered. And
so it sounds like you're saying that historically, even going back to the 17th century, that you're mentioning, and we'll go more into this in a minute, how the Ukrainians have never really had their own identity, have always been revolting against others, I guess, in terms of power struggles of trying to have control over their lands. And at the same time, the Jews have always been the victim of those overall generic revolts against the other landowners, power struggles of other entities.
Correct. Jews are in the wrong place. And the Jews, for survival, they had connections with the sovereigns, whoever was in control, and that put them in a more precarious situation when revolts broke out.
Right,
and
because then you're attacked by the new power
right.
against, and the Jews were automatically had the protection of the existing power, so they're taken out as being part of the enemies and considered spies, etc., etc.
Right.
So okay, so now jump to the point about the Ukrainian identity.
Right.
What's the deal with the Ukrainian identity? You say it's always been a struggle for them. What's the history there?
Ukraine. And by the way, there are other lands like this, such as Galicia, but the Ukraine more so is a land that goes back to Middle Ages where there was a Slavic identity. But despite having identity inherent in the area as a nation, they really never had the independence that they wanted. And when they finally got their independence after the First World War, it was declared during what we call the Russian Civil War in 1919, and once again, it's a three-way civil. It was in jeopardy because Bolsheviks also were fighting for that land, as well as we call White Russians. It was a three-way civil war over the Ukraine, and in the middle, once again, are the Jews, and every side
was killing the Jews.
Was killing Jews. The Soviets, or not yet Soviets, but the Bolsheviks were the least severe, but they also perpetrated pogroms. The most pogroms were perpetrated by the Ukrainian Cossacks, by Simon Petliura and the nationalists who sought independence.
Wait, and what you're referring to right now, this three-way civil war, where basically the Jews were killed by all three sides.
Right.
Was after the atrocities of World War I?
That's correct.
Meaning World War I ended, the Jewish people were in a sense decimated because of World War I, right, which your book talks about.
Right.
And what you're talking about right now is an even extensive atrocities that continued for the Jews because of a continued three-way civil war.
Jews suffered.
Whoa.
The Jews suffered tremendously during the First World War.
Wow.
And Ukraine, of all places, perhaps a little less than like Lithuania for several reasons. Maybe we'll get to later, maybe not. But then comes the Ukrainian Civil War, and it's the worst massacre, perhaps, of Jews since the time of destruction of the Second Temple, or perhaps, I mean, it's hard to say. Maybe during Khmelnytsky, it's hard to say. Wow. But here you have 1 million Jews in Ukraine, and it's hard to estimate. Ukrainians, first of all, no one kept figures like the Nazis did. And also, people ran, they fled, they flew into the forest where there was no food, or who knows what would happen. And so if an account's read that in one city, 1,000 Jews were murdered, we don't know exactly in total how many Jews were massacred. It's just hard to say the total.
Right.
People say 100,000. It could have been a lot more.
Right.
Could have been. We just don't know for sure.
Right. We don't have the records for the specific numbers.
Right. We don't have specific numbers. However, this was a blow to Ukrainian Jewry, which I mean, this was a very severe blow.
All right. So then going back to the point you were saying, so Ukraine finally had its own independence for the first time after this three-way civil war post World War I.
Post World War I, and eventually skipping through a lot of details, this area becomes part of the Soviet Union. So now Ukraine, which was under the control of the Russian czars since the late 1700s, and now it goes from czarist control to the control of the USSR. They're going to be under the control of the Soviet Union. They'll be part of the Soviets. And
so therefore they lost their independence once again?
They lost their independence. And
by
the way,
how many years did they have?
Let me just explain one thing here. I want to mention one thing here. And this goes back to Stalin in 1928. This is how he had the control.
Right.
You couldn't have done this without the control of the Ukraine. And so they're going to stay under control of the Soviet Union until 1991, when they become an independent nation. And so this is a big moment for the Ukrainians. And at that moment, it's sort of a divided. You mentioned divisions before. Let me mention divisions.
Please go.
All right. So Ukraine is really divided between those Ukrainians who in the east, mostly in the east. I mean, it's not 100%.
Right.
It's mixed, but the higher percentage of Ukrainians in the east are sympathetic with Russia, and they favor Russian rule, and that includes Putin as well. I mean, if a person were to do an interview, like, how do you feel? Depends where you are to get reaction.
Right. I've heard 3 stories directly from Ukrainians, 2 in America and 1 in Israel, who've all 3 said they support Putin and they support the invasion of Ukraine. 3 Ukrainians.
Right.
So it shows you, like, wait, well, something's going off here.
There are Ukrainians who consider themselves Russians, and they consider their background, their cultural background, their heritage Russian, and they look to Putin as their leader. And on the other hand, there are Ukrainians who consider themselves more European, and hence this is really the root of what we have right now and of the conflict, because these people in the west of Ukraine who consider themselves more European, they sought an alliance with NATO, NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization, formed by President Harry Truman in 1949. The purpose was to protect Western states against the Soviet Union. And so now Ukraine had this notion, which was supported by the president, by Zelensky, of joining NATO. And so troops theoretically could be looking on Russia from eastern Ukraine. And this was a matter of concern to the Russians. And
because also it goes against, if I'm not mistaken, the Munich Agreement that NATO is not allowed to include Ukraine as part of NATO. Well, I understood that's part of the tension going on in terms of the power play between the West and Russia.
That is part of the tension, but there's something else here, and this is where history comes to play.
Please.
Russia as a nation, like, we're all instinctive. We're a product of our past.
Right.
The past makes us as individuals.
Right.
Just like a personal history creates us as people, as a nation, as people. We're molded by our collective experiences.
Right.
And Russia has faced many foreign invasions for hundreds of years.
Right.
Napoleon, of course, Hitler, Operation Barbarossa, World War II. Destructive is not the word, are not the words to describe what the Russians have went through. And so there's a certain sensitivity to the notion of having your neighbors part of the NATO alliance. And so,
whose whole purpose is to,
NATO basically says this. Yeah. NATO is this.
Yeah.
It's sort of like almost like, I'm going to use the word gang, a group on the street. Like, one guy's attacked, we all attacked.
Right.
So we'll all defend each other.
Right.
So it sort of raises the
bar.
Yes, it raises the bar. Now, the Soviets once had the Warsaw Pact, but with the fall of the Soviet Union, it's no longer.
Right.
So you don't have that counterbalance either. And
right. And Russia is much smaller than it used to be. So it's more in a threatening position that it used to be, as smaller and without the Warsaw Pact, and therefore more feeling of a threat of NATO if it does take over Ukraine.
Russia is still the second largest army in the world. I mean, they are strong, but nonetheless, there's still that there is that sensitivity. But there's another aspect, and I don't know what Putin's thinking, and perhaps this doesn't fit into some sort of grand plan he has. But that's all I'm going to say about that, because I really don't know beyond that.
But you started in terms of the historical. So what is the importance of Ukraine historically to Russia, on the historical level, on the identity level to Russians? Because I understand there's some history there as well in terms of Rus or etc.
First of all, the food supply is a very important issue.
So, and still today,
absolutely.
Still today, the food supply from Ukraine is essential to Russia.
Ukraine feeds a lot of areas, but also it's a buffer. I mean, for invasion, I mean, one thing Russia has is landmass, but it's still a buffer, and once again, I don't know the motives of Putin, but theoretically, if a person wants to expand the empire, certainly Ukraine would be a place to start. But I'm not going to say any more beyond that because I really, frankly, not going to, you know, I can't say for certain what's on his mind.
Right, right.
And whether this is defensive or offensive or a little both or whatever, well, only time will tell.
And in terms of the Jewish community today, I mean, it's very interesting because today in Israel, we have a very large population of Jews who immigrated from Russia, as well as a large population of Jews who immigrated from Ukraine. And I haven't seen much reporting about the street level of Israelis or the Russian versus Ukrainian Jews living here in Israel. Actually, the one report I have seen was about Russians protesting against the Russian government and against Putin for invading Ukraine. That's been one angle here.
Right.
But do you, I imagine, but again, from your book focused on World War I, how there were Jewish soldiers fighting on the Russian side and Jewish soldiers fighting on the German side.
Right.
Do you see a comparison to today's situation, potentially Jewish soldiers again in the Russian army and Jewish soldiers again in the Ukrainian army, or is it a different situation?
Yeah, I'll tell you, Avi, on that, I really don't see the symmetry here. I mean, you may have Jews on different sides here, but it's really, I mean, it's really Jews part of the same nation who have different perspectives. And, you know, it's almost, one can say, I mean, it's not the same situation, it's very different, and there were a lot less Jews in the United States during the American Civil War. But you had Jews in the Confederacy, a smaller number. You had around 2,000 Jews fighting, 1,500 Jews fighting Confederacy, and like 7,000 or 8,000 Jews fighting for the Union. So, and they
did find themselves on opposite sides of the battlefield sometimes.
Sides battlefield, same nation. Here, I mean, it's far from that. We don't have that, you know, but we have differences. There's certainly differences here.
Right, but you bring up a good point, because you do write in your book, back in terms of World War I, of the deep sense of loyalty.
Right.
German Jews felt in World War I to then fight as proud Germans,
right,
versus the Russian Jews who were fighting as proud Russians. Again, their Jewish identity was nothing, didn't come to the fore. It was, they were fighting as proud Russians or proud Germans, and then they were fighting each other.
Well, I would say the Jewish identity also came to the floor.
Okay.
Look, this is an era of nationalism, an era where...
Talking about World War I again,
yeah,
right?
Excuse me. World War I was an era of nationalism, an era of loyalty to one side. There's an era where nations were bound together by common languages, common cultures, and Jews in their respective countries, for the most part, wanted to feel part of the countries they lived in. They wanted to be accepted, and they wanted to be a sense of belonging. War came along, and all of a sudden, Jews had that opportunity.
Right.
Initially, look, when war begins, no one expects it to turn out the way it did.
Right.
You know, so initially there was some enthusiasm. Of course, over the time, that's going to wane big time.
Right. When you see the destruction, you see the
destruction
death,
and the
your
death
friends,
and horror. So for Jews in every country, the only country I'd say there were certain minor exceptions. For example, some Jewish immigrants in England and in the Lower East Side of New York and other city centers who are Russian immigrants were reluctant to go to war against excuse me. The Jews who were immigrants they felt they were reluctant to fight with, excuse me, I got confused a second. They're reluctant to fight on the same time as ally of Russia, who had persecuted the Jews, Kishinev pogroms, and suffering for hundreds of years under the Russian Tsar, and they were reluctant to fight. That's until 1917.
Meaning, and that's why they immigrated to America, because they didn't want to.
Well, they left Russia, but they didn't immigrate for that reason. For the most part, there were some Jews who did emigrate to avoid, but for the most part, most of the immigrants to America came in the decades earlier, 1881 to 1920 to 1914. Most of the immigrants had already arrived. In 1914, immigration to America stopped during the war, but majority of Jews at that time In 1917, it changes. When America enters the war, then loyalties change. We'll fight for America. In England, similar situation. Jews in the East End of London were reluctant to fight initially for to join up. They weren't citizens, so they didn't have to. So it was a source of embarrassment to the native British Jews who want to see like, rah-rah for our side. They want to see loyalty. They want to see patriotism. And they were saying, we don't want to fight Russia alongside Russia. We don't want them as allies.
Right. Again, World War II, Russia was allies with the Allies. So I want to go back to World War I. Another we touched upon this and back to your book. I was extremely, I don't know whether touched or moved is the right word, but extremely impressed by how you focused in the book on the surprise how Jewish soldiers from each side, whether a Jewish soldier for Germany in World War I or a Jewish soldier for Russia, then experienced and saw with their own eyes how their own armies, they were proud Jews fighting for Russia or proud Jews fighting for Germany, then acted towards their fellow Jews, innocent civilians, when they then conquered the areas of Jewish villages or where Jews lived. Can you touch upon that as well? Because I believe that was like a real eye opener for me.
Well, this is an enormous subject related to the war. Every country, there isn't a country where Jews fought and bled, and at the end were not recognized. Were not for their patriotism. Were not. There was no reciprocity. What the freedoms that they hoped for were generally not there. Let me explain. I'm going to go brief from country to country here, okay?
Okay, but if I understand correctly, what you're trying to say is the Jews fought as proud local citizens of that country, yet they never got their recognition in terms of rights and equality even after.
War is the door to emancipation.
Okay.
It's the door to, but it never really happened.
Okay.
That's what I meant to say.
Okay.
The freedoms that they would be hoped for, the recognition they hoped to receive didn't really come. And I'm going to go quickly through a few countries.
Okay.
All right. Germany, 100,000 Jews fought for Germany. 12,000 died on the battlefield.
In World War I.
World War I. And even during the war, there were already expressions of anti-Semitism.
In Germany.
They're already questioning the patriotism of German Jews. And if there's any community that was loyal, it was German Jewry. And of course, post-war is going to lead to the beginning of Nazi Germany and to the rise of fascism. And
right, and you write about how immediately after the war, the Germans were scapegoating the Jews for the fact that they lost the war. Meaning immediately afterwards, there was the playing upon anti-Semitic tones to develop a hatred for Jews, that they were the reason we lost the war. And
the feeling was the generals knew they lost, but a lot of the troops felt they didn't really lose, and they were looking for blame, and they found it in the Jewish community.
Right, even though they had 100,000 Jewish soldiers who fought as proud Germans.
Out of 600,000 Jews altogether.
Wow.
Yeah. They called it stab in the back. That's what they called it.
Wow. And that reminds me, one story you write about in your book is about a woman who's being taken off to the trains in the Holocaust, in World War II.
Right.
And she lifts up like the medal or the letter of accreditation that her son got in appreciation of his valiant, heroic acts fighting for the German army in World War I. And she showed it to the Nazi soldiers saying, look, my son was a proud Jew, a proud German soldier. Don't take me off to the trains. And they basically just threw it on the floor and they took her.
They disregarded it. They said, your request is denied. And in that chapter, I have letters from soldiers discussing their willingness to die. And they're posthumous letters, by the way. These soldiers,
German soldiers willing to die on behalf of Mother Germany, right? On
behalf of Mother Germany, and it shows the expressions of loyalty from all different types of German Jews. Some German Jews were religious Orthodox and were observant. There were some who were very secular. All different types, and the expressions were on that subject from the soldiers were pretty much not so different. And Russia. 600,000 Jews fought for Mother Russia.
In World War One.
In World War One. When I say Russia, by the way, I'm sorry, Avi. When I say Russia, I'm referring to Poland as well. The Ukraine, by the way, confusion, the Ukraine and Ukraine. Ukraine is the term we use since 1991. Because Ukraine implies a sovereign entity. Right. The applies a territory.
Okay.
Like the Ukraine's in territory. Anyways, so Ukraine, Lithuania, Belarus, Poland as well.
Russia. So
right.
all those entities, 600,000
600,000 Jews fought. 100,000 died on the battlefield.
Wow.
And that's 100,000 died on the battlefield. Right, that's correct. The fighting was horrendous. Russian Jews, while they were fighting, their wives and children were facing expulsions from their homes en masse.
By whom? Who was expelling them?
The Russian military.
So even though they were Russian citizens and their family members were fighting as Russian soldiers, the Russian military were expelling Jewish villages and shtetls, etc.
By their own people.
Right, and that's not even what they're going to experience when the Germans conquer those cities and towns. Right. That was just from the Russians.
See, Germans are pressing eastward, and as the Russians' forces are retreating, they are leveling accusations against Jews
that they were spying for the Germans, right?
And
you're
disloyalty.
Right, and disloyal.
And so once again, and now,
so we were always hit. We were hit by both sides.
Right. Now, there were a lot of Jews in Russia who had a very traditional outlook of the world, and they didn't really see much coming from war. They didn't see any gain. They didn't see anything from it, frankly.
Right.
They saw misery. But nonetheless, you have to go. You have to go. Right. So there wasn't always that.
Not all 100,000 were patriotic Russians, you're saying?
I'm just saying many of the Jews of Russia at this point had still very traditional outlook of the world, and they didn't see any purpose necessarily to the war.
Right.
It was mixed in Russia. Some were more modern, more emancipated, and some thought this would be a bridge initially.
Right.
But over the course of time, everyone hated it because there was nothing but misery. Great Britain, once again, you had 45,000 out of 240,000 Jews who served, and
in World War I for the British Army.
For the British Army, and once again, there will be tremendous betrayal because the British will issue the Great Jewish Emancipation Proclamation, the Balfour Declaration of November 2nd, 1917, and there's a hope that as the British eventually will have control over the land of Israel as they defeat the Turks. There's a hope that something very special will come out of this, but it will not come out the way Jews had hoped. Right. There will be tremendous struggle and fight because the British are going to not live up to the terms. And so once again, betrayal, American Jewry, 3 million Jews lived in America at the time, second largest world Jewish community. And
this is World War I time.
World War I, and 250,000 Jews fight for the Americans. The Americans come in late into the war, and they are mostly victors. So not the same casualty count, fortunately for the Americans, as other nations.
Right.
But when the war is over, there will be a takeover. Isolationism, feelings of isolationism will take over America for the most part, and Jews will also be looked at really as outsiders. Jews will be, to a certain extent, isolated, and that will impact legislation keeping Jewish immigrants out of America. It's Jewish and Catholic immigrants who will be restricted from America. 1921 Johnson-Reed Act and 1924 Johnson-Reed Act. And now for the Catholics in Italy, it was difficult. They were denied coming to America, and of course they're going to be in Italy during the Second World War. But of course, for the Jews, it's going to be catastrophic.
Right. So it's interesting. So going back to the Ukraine, Poland, Lithuania, Russia story of World War I actually grew up on a personal story. I never mentioned this to you. My grandmother's family lived in a little shtetl, a little village in Poland, and she remembers the World War I time period. And one of her stories is one day it was the Russian army in their village, and it was the Russian soldiers forcing her father. Her father had a little shop, forcing her father to just give them all their food. and the next day it would be another army that would be in there
Right.
and forcing her father to give their soldiers food. And there were some days where she, as a little girl, she remembers them hiding their father so that he wouldn't be taken by the army or killed by whatever army's running through their village at the time.
Right.
And then like just giving the soldiers free food or just handing them. And she talks about peeling the potatoes
Right.
for the Russian soldiers, but keeping the peels for themselves to eat because
Right.
they were taking all their food. They would have no food. And she said the lesson that her father got, thank God the family survived, her parents, they survived World War I because they could have been killed. They saw people killed in the
Right.
streets every day. It could be a different army coming through your village. And she said her father learned from that, we got to get out of Europe. And then after World War I, he escaped one by one, like somehow found the money to escape and get visas one family member at a time to escape and make it to America. And that's how my family got out of Europe before World War II, because my great grandfather at the time learned the lesson that it's not safe for Jews here anymore in Europe,
Right.
and went to America.
Right.
Any final? Yeah.
I just want to say it's an important point, a very important point, Avi. You know, immigrants came to America over a 40-year period of time. American Jewry became an enormous community. And for those who were thrown out of their homes in Lithuania, the great Gerush, the great expulsion from Lithuania in 1915 on Erev Shavuot, where 250,000 Jews thrown out of their home, they're pushed further eastward out of what's known as the Pale Settlement. The Pale Settlement was a ghetto, a huge ghetto where Jews were confined. And we made up like 30% of the population, in certain parts more, certain parts less, but we were an enormous entity there. And it was a blessing and a curse. It was not good, because for many Jews who were thrown out of the Pale Settlement, the whole infrastructure of the Jewish community was broken. You know, the shtetl, the shul, the synagogue, the Jewish school, the mikveh, all the things that held the community together were broken. And so the Jewish community would somehow have to rebuild and then face the horrors of communism under communism, which is really incredibly difficult.
Right.
And by the other hand, the Nazis, many areas where Jews had fled or where they were resettled, many of the areas, some returned back home eventually to Lithuania, but for those who didn't, they would be outside the boundaries where the Nazis conquered in the Second World War. They would not be in the same dire straits.
Interesting. So what final words do you have for people to say to get a better grasp of understanding the historic perspective, understanding what is going on today, what we're witnessing in Ukraine and Russia, to leave people with?
I would say this to people. Number one, to understand this conflict, or frankly,
any conflict,
one has to have an idea of the past to understand the present. Number one, first thing. Second thing, many predictions coming out as to what's going to be. I have none. In other words, I look at the past and I analyze the past, but I really will not give predictions for the future here. And the third thing I would say, and this is going off topic, a drop, is, a person can, if they wish, if they know an organization that helps refugees or refugees, Ukrainians, Jews. I mean, if they know of something, I mean, they could choose to try to help ease the suffering.
Yeah, and anyone who hopefully people are interested, look and vet the organization you want to support, because in times of crisis, so many non-reliable organizations and causes pop up for you to donate money to, and in the end, the money is not going to where you really want it to go. So really do your due diligence and vet that organization to ensure that your money that you're coming from a good place is actually going to be used correctly to help the cause, help the refugees. And I guess the final note I want to make, and I imagine you'll agree as well, since we're both sitting here in Jerusalem, the major lesson for the Jewish people is that, again, you're talking about World War I. We just went through World War I, World War II, and today, right? the only place in the world where we Jews, the Jewish people as a nation, have the ability to defend ourselves and not have to rely on foreign powers, one, and not be under threat of the foreign powers in charge of us, of turning against us, is Israel. That's lesson number one. Right. And so so as a Jew, I want people to come live in Israel because this is our homeland and come for the positive. But here's a place to come if you have to run away from Ukraine, like today, if a Jew to leave and get out of the danger zone. But the other major lesson is, again, here in Israel, we're always bombarded with peace talks and peace initiatives and international guarantees on the United Nations. We're going to put United Nations soldiers, or we'll put high-tech surveillance cameras that will be watched in United Nations soldiers, or America will put soldiers, or America will give us the high-tech to prevent, and we can leave the Jordan Valley, so there'll be a buffer. No, we cannot count on any international assurances, promises, treaties, etc. Here you're talking about Ukraine is on their own, even though the NATO countries are there to help. Well, we can't always trust them. In the end, you have to be able to trust yourself. And here, the modern state of Israel, a third Jewish commonwealth, we have to be able to trust ourselves and not rely on international guarantees.
Right. And I want to make one more point here, Avi.
And trust the one above. That's the most important. He's the one that protects us.
Ukrainians were promised when they gave up their nuclear arsenal
in 1994, right?
Correct. During the Clinton administration, they were assured that their sovereignty would be respected.
Right. Because if they would have the nuclear arsenal today, Russia would not be doing what it's doing, right? They relied on Western promises. They relied on President Clinton, the United States, and they gave up their deterrence.
This, unfortunately, does not send a great message.
That's a good way to end things.
Yeah.
Professor Larry Domenech, thank you so much for your insight.
It's good to be here, Avi.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Listen. You know me. I'm a history buff, and Jewish history to general history, and it's so important for people to learn. And I hope people got a little bit of understanding. Whether they totally understand today, that was not the purpose of this talk, but to have more of an understanding of the historical aspect of it, as well as the Jewish aspect to the story. You definitely provided that. So I hope people are walking away from here a little more knowledgeable and understanding. And if this was beneficial, I hope you share this video with other people as well. And the bottom line is, no matter what, pray. Number two, pray to the one above. Let's have trust in the one above. And number three, if you're a Jew, if you haven't started planning to come home to Israel, no matter where you're living, and even if it's in the Western countries of Australia, Canada, America, Britain, France, start making your plans. Right now, things might be okay, but we never know when things turn around. Then history teaches us, and I'm sitting with a history professor. History teaches us no matter how good things go for us in whatever countries, in the end, times change and things ends up being bad. And the one place we can come to, we have our own challenges to work with, but the place we're supposed to work with them and be in our own indigenous, natural culture of the Jewish state is the third Jewish commonwealth, the modern state of Israel. So start planning to come home if you haven't started planning yet. Thank you so much for watching, everyone, and please share the video. Signing off for another episode of The Pulse of Israel here in our eternal and ancestral homeland, the land of Israel, in our eternal and undivided capital since King David's time, the city of Jerusalem. Shalom, everyone.
Pulse of Israel, frontline videos from the Holy Land. Support our work by donating today.